you have been told oil wars are fought for oil. That is the story everyone accepts without question, and it is the story that lets the real machine keep running underneath it. Nobody invades a country just to pump crude out of the ground and sell it on the open market. That math has never worked. The cost of a modern war measured in trillions has almost never been justified by the value of the oil beneath the sand. So if the official reason does not add up, something else is paying for the war. And once you see what that something is, you will never watch a headline about the Middle East, a pipeline, or a sanctions announcement the same way again. Start with the number that nobody puts on the recruitment poster. The Iraq War, launched in 2003, is conservatively estimated to have cost the United States somewhere between $1.7 and $2 trillion in direct military spending, with long-term costs including veteran care and interest on war debt, pushing the total closer to $3 trillion when the accounting is honest. Iraq's total proven oil reserves are worth an enormous amount over decades, but even at generous long-run price assumptions, the war cost more than the oil could plausibly generate in profit for any single actor extracting it under normal commercial terms. If the goal was simply to steal barrels, it was one of the worst investments in modern history. So the war was never really about barrels. 3. It was about something oil represents but is rarely allowed to be discussed as control over the pricing, the currency, and the flow of the most strategically important commodity on Earth. To understand oil wars, you stop thinking about oil as a fuel and start thinking about it as a monetary system wearing a disguise. In 1945, aboard the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake, President Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia and struck an arrangement that would define the next 80 years of global finance. The United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi kingdom. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would ensure a steady flow of oil to Western markets. That handshake evolved by the early 1970s into something far more powerful, forged in the wreckage of the Bretton Woods system after the United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971. With the dollar no longer tied to gold, Washington needed something else to anchor global demand for its currency. It found the answer in Riyadh. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in dollars, in return received American military protection and advanced weapons systems. Because Saudi Arabia was the swing producer of OPEC, and OPEC controlled the majority of the world's tradable oil, single agreement meant that virtually every country on Earth that needed oil now needed dollars first. Japan needed dollars. Germany needed dollars. Later, China needed dollars. Nations that had never held a dollar reserve in their lives suddenly had to acquire them just to keep their economies running. This is the Petrodollar System, and it is arguably the most successful currency arrangement in modern history because it did not require a treaty everyone signed. It required nothing more than the world's need for energy and one producer's willingness to price that energy in a single currency. Here is the part that rarely makes it into the textbook. The nation that controls the pricing currency of the world's most essential commodity does not merely benefit from trade. It gains the ability to run enormous deficits without immediate consequence, because the rest of the world is structurally obligated to hold its currency in reserve. The United States could print, borrow, and spend at scales that would collapse almost any other economy, because the entire planet needed dollars to buy energy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is public, well-documented monetary architecture. Explains why the defense of that architecture has on multiple occasions looked indistinguishable from a defense of oil itself, even when oil was never the primary target. Now overlay the map. The global oil trade does not move freely across open water the way people imagine. Funnels through a small number of narrow choke points, and whoever can threaten those choke points holds leverage over the entire system regardless of how much oil they personally produce. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point barely 21 miles wide, roughly a fifth of the world's total petroleum liquids consumption on any given day. The Strait of Malacca funnels the energy lifeline of China, Japan, and South Korea through a channel that could be blockaded by a handful of warships. The Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea connect Gulf oil to European markets, and disruption there, as the world saw when a single container ship ran aground in 2021 and cost global trade an estimated $9 billion a day, can ripple through economies that have nothing to do with the region itself. This is why the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain, a tiny nation whose entire strategic value lies not in its own modest oil reserves, but in its position at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Militaries are not stationed near oil because they want to drink it. Stationed at choke points because controlling the choke point means controlling the terms under which everyone else gets to move their energy, their trade, and by extension, their entire economies. This is the first hidden reveal. Oil wars are rarely fought to seize oil fields, fought to control the architecture that determines who gets to sell oil, in what currency, and through which routes. Ownership of the well matters far less than control of the tap, which brings us to the moment that most people misremember. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The common explanation is that he wanted Kuwait's oil. That much is true, but it is incomplete. Iraq emerged from its brutal 8-year war with Iran in 1988, carrying roughly $80 billion in war debt, a significant portion of it owed to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the very Gulf states that had funded Iraq as a buffer against Iranian expansion. Saddam wanted that debt forgiven. Kuwait refused, and worse, Kuwait was widely accused by Baghdad of slant drilling into the shared Rumaila oil field and exceeding OPEC production quotas, which suppressed global oil prices and starved Iraq's already devastated economy of revenue it desperately needed to rebuild. Saddam framed the invasion as economic self-defense against a neighbor he believed was financially strangling him. The world framed the response, Operation Desert Storm, as the liberation of a sovereign nation. Both framings were real, and both concealed the deeper truth. Whoever controlled Kuwait's oil production controlled a meaningful lever on global oil supply, and a meaningful lever on global oil supply is a lever on the value of every currency priced against energy costs. The United States did not spend $60 billion assembling a 35-nation coalition purely out of humanitarian concern for a small monarchy. It did so because an Iraq that controlled both its own reserves and Kuwait's would have commanded roughly 20% of the world's proven oil reserves, enough to single-handedly influence OPEC pricing decisions, and, by extension, challenge the pricing architecture the United States had spent 2 decades building. 13 years later, the pattern repeated with a twist that almost nobody discusses on camera. In November 2000, Iraq announced it would begin selling its oil exclusively in euros rather than dollars, under the United Nations Oil for Food program. It was a small, almost bureaucratic-sounding decision, but it was also the first real crack in the petrodollar's monopoly by a major oil exporter. Came at a moment when European monetary union was gaining credibility as a genuine dollar alternative. Whether or not this decision was a primary driver of the 2003 invasion is fiercely debated among economists and historians. Reasonable people land on different sides of that argument. What is not debatable is the sequence of events. Within weeks of the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Iraq's oil sales were switched back to dollars. Some analysts treat this as coincidence, a natural reversion once the Oil for Food program ended. Others treat it as confirmation that currency architecture, not weapons of mass destruction, was the load-bearing wall of the entire operation. Either way, the episode reveals something important. The moment a mid-sized oil producer tests an alternative to the dollar pricing system, the geopolitical temperature around that producer tends to rise sharply, and that pattern has repeated with a strange consistency across multiple decades and multiple regions. Consider Libya. In 2009 and 2010, Muammar Gaddafi pushed a proposal for an African gold-backed currency, the gold dinar, that would have allowed African and Middle Eastern nations to trade oil and other commodities outside the dollar and the French-backed CFA franc entirely. Libya at the time held over 140 tons of gold reserves, one of the largest holdings in Africa, positioning it to potentially anchor such a system. In 2011, Libya became the target of a NATO intervention framed around civilian protection during the Arab Spring uprising. Gaddafi was killed months later. Libya's oil production, once over 1.6 million barrels a day, collapsed by more than 90% and has never fully recovered, while the country fractured into competing factions that persist to this day. Was the gold dinar proposal the cause of the intervention? Diplomatic cables and internal assessments suggest currency concerns were part of a broader strategic calculus that included human rights, regional stability, and long-standing Western discomfort with Gaddafi's decades of unpredictable foreign policy. The honest answer is that oil wars are almost never monocausal. They sit at the intersection of currency architecture, resource control, regional power balance, and domestic political survival for the leaders on every side. But the currency thread runs through nearly every major conflict in the region, with a consistency too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Now, widen the lens to the other side of the ledger, because oil wars have never been paid for by taxpayers alone. They have been extraordinarily profitable for a small set of players, and understanding who profits explains why these conflicts keep recurring even when they fail to achieve their stated objectives. Defense contractors are the most obvious beneficiaries. In the years following the 2003 invasion, the 5 largest American defense contractors saw their combined stock value multiply several times over. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Gears do not merely sell weapons during a war. They sell the reconstruction contracts afterward, the private security details, the logistics and supply chains, the reconnaissance drones, training programs for new local militaries built almost entirely on imported hardware. War in the oil-producing world is not an interruption of business. For a specific set of firms, it is the business model, generating recurring, multi-decade revenue streams that dwarf what any single oil concession could deliver. Then there are the Gulf monarchies themselves, who benefit from instability in a way that rarely gets discussed openly. Every time a regional rival is weakened, whether Iraq after 2003 or Iran under sustained sanctions, the remaining oil producers gain pricing power and market share. Saudi Arabia's state oil company alone generates revenue that dwarfs the GDP of most nations, has used moments of regional disruption to expand its own influence over OPEC decision-making, sometimes flooding the market to punish rivals and crush the economics of competing producers, including, in 2014 and again in 2020, the American shale industry itself. Which brings us to the mechanism that quietly rewired the entire system, American shale. For nearly half a century, the defense of Gulf oil chokepoints was treated as a vital American interest because the United States genuinely needed that oil to keep its own economy running. Changed with hydraulic fracturing. Between 2008 and 2019, American oil production roughly tripled, and the United States became the largest producer of crude oil on Earth, surpassing both Saudi Arabia and Russia. Suddenly, the country that had spent trillions defending Persian Gulf shipping lanes needed those lanes far less for its own energy security. This single technological shift quietly detonated decades of strategic logic. This began openly questioning why Washington should keep footing the bill for Gulf security when the oil flowing through Hormuz was now overwhelmingly destined for Asian markets, particularly China, rather than American refineries. The old justification, protecting the oil we need, evaporating. What remained was the deeper justification few politicians say aloud, protecting the dollar's pricing architecture and denying rival powers the ability to build an alternative system, regardless of whose tankers are actually passing through the strait, is where the fragility of the entire structure becomes visible. The petrodollar system depends on a specific and increasingly strained condition, that oil-producing nations continue choosing to price and settle their exports in dollars. That condition is no longer guaranteed. 2023, Saudi Arabia signaled openness to accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales to Beijing, its largest customer, something that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. China has spent years building yuan-denominated oil futures contracts on the Shanghai Exchange. Russia, cut off from dollar-based systems by sanctions following its invasion of Ukraine, has aggressively pivoted to selling oil in yuan, rupees, and other currencies, demonstrating in real time that a major producer can survive, even thrive commercially, outside the dollar system when sufficiently motivated. None of this has collapsed the petrodollar yet. The dollar still settles the overwhelming majority of global oil transactions, but the erosion is measurable. And it is accelerating in a way that would have been unimaginable to the architects of the 1970s arrangement. This fragility connects to a darker economic truth that oil-producing nations have wrestled with for a century: the resource curse. Countries with abundant oil wealth frequently develop weaker institutions, more corruption, and more authoritarian governance than countries without it, because oil revenue flows directly to whoever controls the state, removing the need to tax citizens, and with it, the pressure for accountable governance that taxation historically creates. Nigeria has exported well over $600 billion worth of oil since the 1960s, yet a majority of its population lives on less than $2 a day, explained not by scarcity, but by the specific incentive structure oil wealth creates for the elites who control extraction contracts. Venezuela, sitting atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, larger than Saudi Arabia's, watched its economy implode into hyperinflation and mass immigration once mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions combined to strangle production capacity. The same commodity that built the petrodollar system into the most powerful currency arrangement in history has simultaneously wrecked the internal economies of many nations lucky enough to sit above it. Oil does not automatically create prosperity. It creates concentrated power. Concentrated power without accountability tends toward extraction rather than development. Now widen the lens one more time, because the true cost of oil wars extends far beyond the battlefield ledger. The Iraq War alone is estimated to have resulted in several 100,000 direct and indirect deaths, displaced millions of people, and destabilized a region to the point that it directly enabled the rise of ISIS, an organization that at its territorial peak controlled land roughly the size of the United Kingdom and generated revenue estimated at up to $1 billion a year, largely through the black market sale of captured oil fields, smuggled through networks that, in a grim irony, sometimes passed through the same regional trading routes the original war was meant to secure. Instability begets instability, and the economic cost of that instability in refugee resettlement, in counterterrorism spending, in the destabilization of neighboring economies, in disrupted trade routes, ultimately dwarfs the value of any oil field the conflict was ostensibly fought to control. And now the final layer, the one that changes how you should understand everything that came before it. The entire architecture built around oil, the petrodollar, choke points, the defense contracts, the OPEC pricing games, the currency wars fought in the shadow of literal wars, exists on top of a resource the world is actively planning to phase out. The International Energy Agency projects that global oil demand could peak before the end of this decade as electric vehicle adoption accelerates and renewable energy costs continue falling faster than almost any forecaster predicted a decade ago. Major oil-producing nation knows this. It is why Saudi Arabia is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into Vision 2030, an attempt to diversify its economy away from oil dependency before the music stops. Why the Gulf states are racing to extract maximum value from their reserves now, rather than later, accelerating production even as prices soften. Because a barrel left in the ground in a world that no longer needs it is a barrel worth nothing. Creates a strange and volatile endgame. The very nations whose power was built on control of oil are now the ones with the strongest incentive to keep the wars, the alliances, pricing architecture running exactly long enough to extract every last dollar of value before the underlying commodity becomes a stranded asset. So when you next hear that a conflict in an oil-producing region is being fought over resources, hold two ideas at once. Stated reason is rarely a lie, but it is almost never the whole truth. Beneath every oil war sits a currency, and beneath every currency sits a system of alliances, naval choke points, defense contracts, and elite incentives that long outlive the specific dictator, specific invasion, or the specific headline that triggered the intervention. Oil was never really the prize. Oil was the mechanism, the pressure point, the commodity specific enough to anchor an entire global monetary order to a handful of countries and a handful of decisions made in rooms most of the world never sees. The wars fought over it were never really about barrels beneath the sand. Were about who gets to write the rules for how the modern world pays for its own survival. And that is a war that never actually ends. It just changes its currency, its choke point, and its cover story.